Hello! In our last lecture, we talked about the events that took place that led up to the Romantic period, and we finished by talking about the French Revolution. The French went into the Revolution wanting to have a constitutional monarchy. They actually got their constitutional monarchy. King Louis XVI did give them that, but a group of extremists called the Jacobins, they started the Reign of Terror. They said that wasn't good enough. They were so hurt. They were so frustrated. They were killing clergy members and aristocrats. So finally, Napoleon Bonaparte is going to step in. He is part of the advisory council. He had distinguished himself throughout his life by his military career. He came from the middle class, so he wasn't an aristocrat, and for that reason, a lot of people liked him. The government was in chaos, and so when he takes over, he is actually going to be able to declare himself emperor. Now, if you think about it, the French went into the revolution wanting to have a representational form of government, and they come out with an emperor, a dictator. But people love Napoleon. One of the reasons why was he was actually considered a romantic hero, because of his concern for the underprivileged, meaning that he realized what had drove France to this revolution was this disparity between the classes, and he worked really hard to try to help the lower classes. He did things like taking some of the land away from the churches and giving it to people so they could use it for farming. He reformed the education system. He was trying to encourage people that they could better themselves as he did. And one of his big accomplishments was changing the tax system. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about how in France, the people who were paying the most taxes were actually the middle class and the lower class people. Aristocracy and clergy members, people from the church, did not pay taxes at all. So what Napoleon did was he said, instead of a flat tax of $1,000 that everyone would have to pay, he says, I'm going to tax you based on how much you make. So it'll be 10% of how much you make. If you only make $10,000, you only have to pay 10% of it. However, Napoleon, in part of his quest to restore pride to France, he started these military campaigns. At first, he was like taking back land that France had lost in previous battles, and then he just kept taking, which led Great Britain and Prussia to band together, and they will eventually defeat him in this very famous battle of Waterloo. After that, he was sent into exile. So now France, they went into the revolution wanting a constitutional monarchy. They end up with a monarch, but they loved him. And then their monarch is taken from them. Napoleon is exiled. He's taken away. So what are the people of France going to do? They actually go back to the royal family, and they put one of King Louis's brothers on the throne. So France will end up with a king again. This one will be Louis XVIII. Okay, so we started to give an idea of what's going on and why people are feeling frustrated, and that is going to lay the groundwork for the Romantic period. One of the most famous poets of the Romantic time period is William Wordsworth, and this poem, The Tables Turned, it explains this feeling that was going on in the Romantic era. His poem says, "One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. Sweet is the lore which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives." So poetry sometimes can be a little tricky. I just wanted to go through with you and explain what he means. One impulse from a springtime wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the wise men of the past can. So what he's saying here is one moment, spending one day in the woods and observing nature will teach you more of how to be a good human being than all the wise men of the past. Here he says, sweet is the lore, sweet are the stories that nature tells, but our meddling, our pesky intellect, we're going to take things apart. Nature has this beautiful form of everything, and we decide we want to take it apart so that we could learn more about it. We murder to dissect. He says, enough of that, enough of science and of art. Don't study things closely, just accept things as they are. Close up those barren leaves. Close the empty pages of your books. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. So the idea here is that intuition is powerful. You don't have to get all of your learning from books. There are things that your gut instinct can teach you about the world. Next, I'm going to go through a list of characteristics. These characteristics are going to be represented in all different forms of art in the Romantic period, whether it's literature or music. And I'm going to give you an example of each of these, but the examples that I give you, they could also apply to other characteristics, because in this period, these are the ideas that are mainly circulating. So first we're going to start with this idea of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is the idea that knowledge that comes from intuition is more valuable than knowledge that comes from reasoning. Our two most famous transcendentalists are Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. These are both American philosophers. So this is an essay that Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, and his essay is called Nature. I'm going to read it for you. It says, "In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods we return to reason, purpose, and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity leaving my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God." So what he's saying here is, in the woods are always young because the woods are always renewing themselves. He calls them the farms of God. He says there's an order and a sanctity, a specialness in the woods. They're a perennial festival. So they're always celebrating something. A springtime wood, like if you look outside right now, the trees all have buds on them or new growth of leaves. In the fall, there's a different kind of beauty, right? The leaves, not here in Florida, but in other places, they turn red and they fall off. In the winter, there's another kind of festival. There's another kind of beauty when ice covers the branches of the trees. And he says that when you go into the woods, you're never going to get tired of this. Every year we see these things over and over again, and they're still so beautiful to us. In the woods, we can return to reason, purpose, and faith. There, I feel that nothing can befall me in life. What he's saying here is that sometimes if you have a bad day and you go for a walk and you spend time with nature, it actually can return you to your reasonable state. Like, let's say you're really, really angry and you go for a walk and you are out in the woods and you're watching the birds. It's going to calm you down. It's going to return you to reason. Nothing can befall me, no disgrace, no calamity leaving my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Nature can actually heal you, is what he's saying here. He says, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the pleasant air, I am uplifted into infinite space. All egotism vanishes. You start to see the bigger picture of the world. You start to see the insignificance of the problems of your individual life because you see yourself as part of this larger system. That's what he means when he says, I become a transparent eyeball. You are part of this grand design. You're part of this plan that nature has. You can feel the universal being, whether it's God or Mother Nature or the Creator. You feel that you're part of their design. You're working within this larger structure, this larger plan. And this is what brings people peace. It brings them back to reason. It actually heals them. So this is a picture of Walden Pond. It's in Concord, Massachusetts. This land was actually owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, but his friend, Henry David Thoreau, goes to live there. In the 1850s, Henry David Thoreau, he's really frustrated with what's going on in society, and he says, I need to get away. So he goes out and he lives on this land for about 2 years, and he writes about it in his book called Walden. In the book that he actually condenses it and makes it only 1 year. But he lives completely by his own skill. So he created his house, he fishes for his food, he bathes himself in this pond every morning. And he does this because he believes that getting in touch with our instincts will actually teach us something. And for the Transcendentalist, what this teaches is more valuable than what you can learn in books. So think about this idea. You can read about making a fire, but you're not going to actually be able to make a fire unless you go out and you do it. It's this experience of learning things. And when you do that, it's going to change how you feel about yourself, right? It's going to show you, wow, I'm capable of all these things. So this is a passage from Thoreau's Walden, and he says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So what he says is, we can get in our bubbles and we can protect ourselves and we could play life safe. But he says that then if that were him, he would have had regrets. He really wanted to front the essential facts of life. He wanted to challenge himself. He wanted to see what he was made of. So that when he does come to die, he can say, yeah, I tried everything. There were times where things were hard, but I stuck with it and I proved to myself that I am capable. Okay, so the next characteristic of the Romantic period that we're going to talk about is this idea of longing for the past. This word, romantic, the Romantic era, it's named after this idea, actually. People during this time period, they go back and they start thinking about the Middle Ages. Now, when we talked about the Middle Ages, we talked about how maybe it was not the greatest time, right? There was the plague, people weren't thinking for themselves, people were illiterate. But the Romantics go back to the Middle Ages because this is a time before industrialization, before people were living in those crowded cities, before the diseases that came with those kind of living conditions. And they said back then, in the Middle Ages, people didn't work in factories. People worked in small shops. And if your parents were bakers, then you would become a baker. And they said there was a beauty to this sort of simple life. And so the Romantics are going to go back to this time period, but they're not going to look at it like it actually was. They're going to look at it through rose-colored glasses. And what that means is they're going to only look at the good parts. They're going to hear these stories about knights and the age of chivalry where people treated each other well. And they're going to tell stories about that. So in fact, many of our fairy tales are based on these stories that were created during the Romantic era. This is an example of this idea of longing for the past. This is the Neuschwanstein Castle. It's in Bavaria, Germany. It was built by King Ludwig II. He actually drained the treasury in order to build this, And he was so focused on escaping that he stopped paying attention to the country. Debt collectors came in and he wasn't paying his debts. He had borrowed a bunch of money to build this, so he was eventually declared insane and ousted. But his castle, it doesn't reflect an actual medieval castle. Medieval castles were used as fortresses. They weren't full of windows and towers. They had thick stone walls. They were dark and damp. But this castle, it's a fairy tale. It's beautiful. It's reimagining, only taking the good parts of the castle and not thinking about the actual reality of the castle. And it is because of King Ludwig's castle that Walt Disney was inspired to create the castles in his parks. The stories of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, those fairy tales, the Grimm fairy tales, were actually written during this Romantic period. Okay, I'm going to hold there and then we'll pick up next time with the Romantic landscape.